Stuart Clark, Thinking with Demons, Preface. This book began Stuart Clark, Thinking with Demons, Preface. This book began as an attempt to fill a gap in historical treatments of witchcraft in early modern Europe. By the early 1980s, modern studies of most aspects of the subject were fast appearing, but no sustained attempt had yet been made to reconsider the views of the many intellectuals, clergymen, theologians, lawyers, physicians, natural philosophers, and the like, who published books about it at the time. Many of these so-called demonologists advocated the prosecution of witches and could plausibly be said to have influenced the trials that took place. But except for a few well-known texts, read largely in isolation, their voluminous writings were neglected by historians, who preferred to focus on the social and institutional configurations of witch hunting, together with the patterns of prosecutions in the various European regions and the local circumstances that produced them. If anything, there was a reaction against studying the intellectual history of these episodes, reflecting an annoyance with the way earlier generations of scholars, especially in Germany around the turn of this century and in America thereafter, had done little else, and done it in a confessional and wholly rationalistic spirit. I had no wish to revive this tradition, or reclaim some kind of priority for demonology. I simply wanted to reinsert the beliefs of early modern intellectuals into the history of witchcraft as one, but only one, of its necessary ingredients. The best way to do this seemed to be to read all the published texts in question, beginning in the 15th century when the learned debate about witchcraft really began, and ending in the early 18th century when it finally lost momentum. Over a dozen years later, I am still confident that demonology ought to have something to offer those seeking to explain the witch trials. But the connection cannot any longer be seen as straightforward, and it is not one that I explore in any direct way. Some of the things I trace in the pages of books, apocalyptic expectations, evangelical campaigns, and political roles, for example, no doubt bear witness to the more general cultural conditions that made witchcraft seem a real and pressing danger, and its eradication a desirable action. But several important studies, notably Robin Briggs's Witches and Neighbors, the social and cultural context of European witchcraft, have now confirmed that most witchcraft accusations and prosecutions were initiated in ways that precluded the immediate impact of intellectuals, even if the subsequent proceedings could be affected by consultations with academic jurists and theologians. It is simply not the case that witchcraft theory caused witch hunts, or that its incidents influenced theirs. Indeed, the reverse is much more likely to have been true. In offering this survey of beliefs, I am, therefore, under no illusions about their possible lack of correlation with events. As usually understood, the enunciation of a belief is, of course, an event, while events are unintelligible without reference to beliefs. This possibility might be worth investigating further, if only to underline the theory-bound nature of demonology and the textual constraints on its authors. But I prefer not to think in terms of such correlations at all, hoping thereby to break the dominance that the study of witchcraft prosecutions has had for so long over the interpretation of witchcraft texts. If it is unwise to treat demonology as a key to the history of the trials, it is also a distortion to make it simply their reflection. What I have attempted, then, is only an account of what writers on witchcraft said about the subject, and the largely intellectual reasons they had for saying it. For this purpose I have thought it best to assume the self-referential character of their texts. Witchcraft theory was not, however, written in isolation and ought not to be read in that way. Another of the features of research that it seemed worthwhile to challenge was the tendency to regard the topic as somehow peculiar and historically unassimilable. I made the further assumption, therefore, that a body of ideas that survived for nearly 300 years must have made some kind of sense, and that this probably lay in its coherence with ideas about other things. I was influenced, in particular, by a remark of Alasdair MacIntyre's, also put to use by Robert Bartlett in his book on medieval ordeals. Quote, "To say that a belief is rational is to talk about how it stands in relation to other beliefs. It soon became apparent that demonology was a case in point, and that witchcraft beliefs at this level were sustained by a whole range of other intellectual commitments. This is because the theoretical arguments clustered around particular issues, whether it was possible or not for witchcraft to happen as a real phenomenon in the natural world, why it was afflicting Europe at a particular time, what kinds of sins it involved, and how clergymen should counteract them, and why rulers and magistrates should act to rid the world of the threat. In effect, demonology was a composite subject consisting of discussions about the workings of nature, the processes of history, the maintenance of religious purity, and the nature of political authority and order. Inevitably, its authors took up particular intellectual positions in relation to these four major topics of early modern thought. Quite simply, their views about witchcraft depended on concepts and arguments drawn from the scientific, historical, religious, and political debates of their time. Equally, by theorizing about witches, they made important contributions to these same debates. The relationships I shall be exploring were very much complementary ones. In many cases, indeed, the subject of witchcraft seems to have been used as a means for thinking through problems that originated elsewhere, and that had little or nothing to do with the legal prosecution of witches. Hence my adoption of the somewhat Levi-Straussian title, Thinking with Demons, to convey this sense of demonology as an intellectual resource. So seamlessly does demonology merge with these other debates, so much do they cease to be other debates, that I would like to propose not the death of the author, but the dissolution of the demonologist. Although I started out by adopting this traditional label, I was soon forced to recognize that it had misleading implications. I rapidly discovered that there was too much demonology embedded in early modern books of all kinds and on many subjects, for it to be attributed to one kind of writer. More seriously, the inference seemed to be that those who wrote about witchcraft were somehow interested in it to the exclusion of anything else. This was their specialty, and an aberrant one at that. But for this mass majority it was not. But for the vast majority it was not. They had many of the other typical, and one might even say ordinary, intellectual interests and affiliations of their age. They were primarily theologians, jurists, philosophers, or whatever, who, in the course of some intellectual or moral project, felt it necessary to turn to the subject to see how it related to their wider concerns. If we go on calling them demonologists, we run the risk of setting them apart from these more general pursuits. Indeed, from precisely the things that help us understand why they were interested in witchcraft at all, and how they could believe in its reality. Of course, as a subject, demonology too was not just concerned with witchcraft. It embraced discussions of magic, of superstition, and, not unnaturally, of demons themselves. But a label that allows for thematic interrelationships does not seem to me to create the same difficulty as a label that hides them. What follows then is not a book about witch hunting, although it might be said to be about witch hating, nor one about demonologists. It is a book about demonology, certainly, but set in a series of contexts drawn from early modern intellectual life as a whole. I have taken seriously the suggestion that the best places to gain historical access to a strange culture are those where its meanings seem most opaque. Such meanings may be intrinsically significant, but concentrating on them serves a more ambitious historical purpose. The witchcraft beliefs of early modern intellectuals seem to be in this category. My aim, therefore, is to make them more intelligible in themselves, but, in doing this, to shed light on the larger intellectual histories to which they belonged. If this interests the historians of such histories, as well as those working on witchcraft matters in particular, the aim will have been achieved. I have divided most of the book between the 4 subject categories already mentioned: science, history, religion, politics. Each of these sections looks at broadly the same body of demonological texts from a particular idiomatic perspective, although different texts and different aspects of the same text achieve prominence at different moments. The 4 sequences of chapters are each introduced by a preliminary discussion of the issues to be raised, after which they move between analysis of discussions within demonology, surveys of the more general debates that animated European intellectuals in the subject area in question, and attempts to relate the two. What I have tried to show in particular is that the belief in witchcraft was congruent with particular kinds of scientific, historical, religious, and political views, and, by implication at least, incongruent with others. Of course, to carve up thought into categories in this way is, if not entirely arbitrary, at least artificial, but this seemed the best way of dealing with a very large number of texts over a very long span of time. The reader will easily detect the overlapping and mutually reinforcing elements that linked the 4 modes of thinking that I have distinguished. The book starts with a further sequence of chapters, also with its own introduction, where the focus is not only on the substance of witchcraft theory, but on its form. To be precise, on both simultaneously. Here, I concentrate on the way the logical and rhetorical choices made by witchcraft authors were themselves constitutive of what they discussed, as well as being typical, again, of those made elsewhere in early modern writing. These are features of demonology best conveyed by the title, language. In bare essence, my argument at this point is much the same as that sketched in A Past and Present essay of 1980, which 1 or 2 people at the time kindly suggested I should develop. I feel a little uneasy about drawing on it again, but in compensation I have greatly amplified its scope, extended it to cover the gendering of witchcraft, and made it flexible enough to deal with the instabilities as well as the stabilities internal to demonology. The result, I hope, is a degree of subtlety that evaded me in the original essay. The reader will not be amused by the idea that this book could have been even longer than it is. The fact remains that, although the 4 chosen subject categories seem to be the most important ones, others might have been added. In particular, that of law and jurisprudence, how witches should be legally apprehended, examined, and punished. I also regret not spending more time on individual authors and individual texts, instead of so often submerging them in general descriptions. It is probably true in addition that my approach is too internalist, concentrating on patterns of thought at the expense of the interests they served and the concrete situations that influenced their expression. Let me say at the outset, therefore, what it would be tedious to repeat throughout, that this is a study of notions of demonic deviance held by those who, in one way or another, were anxious to preserve orthodoxy, and who constructed the difference between the normal world and the world of witchcraft in such a way as to legitimize the institutions to which they belonged or otherwise supported. Most serious of all, I have paid relatively little attention to either the genesis or the decline of the ideas whose character I describe. My reading could, and perhaps should, have been extended back into medieval scholarship and forward into 18th century modernism. Not to do this was, however, a deliberate policy, defended in a short postscript to the book, designed to give prominence to demonology as a working system of belief at the height of its powers to persuade, rather than to those responsible, in some moralistic sense, for either its creation or its overthrow. To write, as I have done, about the rationality and cogency of texts previously condemned for barbarism and inhumanity may invite the charge of excusing the inexcusable. I have certainly tried to rescue demonology from the rationalistic opprobrium once directed at it, but only in the interests of historical symmetry. That is to say, the paying of equal attention to past beliefs that we ourselves would reject, and to those we might accept. I do not think it worthwhile to adopt any particular moral stance with regard to the beliefs and behavior of people living in historically remote societies with standards quite unlike our own, preferring to conserve my moral energies for issues closer to home. If some general lesson is to be gleaned from what follows, it is only that the purportedly most essential, objective, and timeless truths have nothing to commend them, but